Hi guys, I hope you're doing really well. My name is Sarah and welcome to What the Horror, the channel where we talk about horror movies, old and new. Also, welcome to a new episode of Truly Horror, the series where we talk about the true stories, the true events and true crimes surrounding certain horror movies, the behind the scenes stuff that is often stranger and scarier than the movies themselves. Seeing as how Scream 6 is being released this week, we are finally taking a look into the true story behind the 1996 Scream. This is a Truly Horror episode that I've wanted to do for a long time and now seemed like the perfect time. In this episode, we will look at both the true event that inspired the film's story and the inspiration behind the iconic Ghostface killer look. Just a heads up that I will be referencing certain events from the film, and so a spoiler warning is included just in case any of you haven't seen Scream yet. But I'm sure you have. Scream was released in 1996. It was directed by horror legend Wes Craven and has a star-studded cast in Neve Campbell, Drew Barrymore, Courtney Cox, David Arquette, Matthew Lillard, Skeet Ulrich, Rose McGowan and the Fonz himself, Harry Winkler. On its release, Scream was considered a unique horror film that was groundbreaking in a lot of ways. It satirised cliches and tropes of the horror genre that had been set in stone through films like Halloween, Friday the 13th, and even Wes Craven's other horror hit, A Nightmare on Elm Street. For the first time, we were given characters who were fully aware of the world of horror movies and their tropes, even drawing attention to and discussing them. Scream both tipped its hat to and subverted the expectations of the horror movie. Screenwriter Kevin Williamson, the creator of TV shows Dawson's Creek and The Vampire Diaries, and movies such as I Know What You Did Last Summer, The Faculty and Cursed, is the man responsible for the story behind the 1996 meta-slasher film Scream. But the story of Scream, where a masked killer stalks and kills high school students in the town of Woodsboro, tormenting his victims over phone calls, is actually inspired by the real-life event and true story of a serial killer active in the 90s, nicknamed the Gainesville Ripper. The Gainesville Ripper, over the course of 4 days, tortured, mutilated and murdered 5 college students in the town of Gainesville, Florida. Williamson had one day watched a news story on the killer and had become spooked by the brutal murders. And apparently he also became nervous when, after watching the news story, he discovered an open window in his home which he didn't remember opening. This inspired Williamson to sit down and write an 18-page script, which he described as a short story at this point, of a young woman home alone who's tormented over the phone by a stranger and then killed by the masked killer. The film was originally titled Scary Movie, and when Williamson completed it as a full-length script, he had also come up with an outline for 2 potential sequels to the story, one of them based around a college campus, just like the Gainesville murders. The final screenplay for the movie, which went on to be named Scream, isn't a like-for-like retelling of this true event. It only has some similarities to the crimes of the Gainesville Ripper. However, it is this true event that was the inspiration behind the film. And it's this which we're going to talk about today, but I do feel it only fair to include a content warning, I guess. This is a violent and grisly case, and while I won't be including all of the gruesome details, there will be enough that could potentially be upsetting or disturbing, so just bear that in mind. The Gainesville Ripper was a man named Danny Rowling. Danny was born in May 1954 in Shreveport, Louisiana, to parents 19-year-old Claudia and James, a decorated Korean War veteran and police officer. As with a large number of serial killers, Danny Rowling's childhood was not a happy one. Not that that is ever an excuse, but sometimes it helps to see a fuller picture. His father, James, suffered with PTSD after fighting in the Korean War and apparently also had some inherent mental illnesses. James Rowling was a violent man and would physically beat Danny's mother, Claudia, Danny himself, and his younger brother, Kevin. James repeatedly told Danny that he was an unwanted child. He even one day had his police colleagues arrest and remove Danny from the house simply because he was embarrassed by him. Danny Rowling wanted to leave and join the military as soon as he could. He wanted out of the family home, and he eventually joined the Air Force but was kicked out later in 1972 after being arrested for possession of illegal drugs. This wasn't the only incident where Danny Rolling was in trouble with the law. After the Air Force, Danny married a woman named Ometha Loomis in 1974. The two had a daughter together, but soon history was repeating itself and Danny was treating his family the way his father had treated him. Ometha left Danny, and in retaliation, Danny assaulted a young woman who looked like his ex-wife. I mean, that's a whole special kind of something, isn't it? Danny wasn't caught for the assault, but he would spend the next 11 to 13 years in and out of jail because of multiple robberies he committed in the South. In May 1990, Danny was in his childhood home with his parents, and after they got into an argument, the now grown and tall Danny felt much more capable of standing up to his abusive father, and he responded by shooting his father in the face and stomach. James survived the shooting and Danny fled Shreveport and headed for Florida. Danny Rolling arrived in Gainesville, Florida and changed his name to Michael Kennedy Jr. He didn't have a place to stay, so he set up a campsite in some woodland near the University of Florida. One evening, Danny spotted two freshman students from the University of Florida, 18-year-old Sonia Larson and 17-year-old Christina Powell, walking home to their apartment. He followed them and decided to return the following night. In the early hours of the morning of Friday the 24th of August 1990, Danny Rolling approached the Williamsburg Village apartments wearing a ski mask, leather gloves, and carrying a kit that consisted of a screwdriver, a penlight, Marine Corps knife, duct tape, and a pistol. He broke into the girl's apartment and found Christina Powell asleep on the sofa. He watched her for a moment but then decided to take a look around, and he found Sonia Larson asleep in her bed upstairs. He placed a strip of 6-inch duct tape over her mouth to stop her from screaming, and then stabbed her multiple times in her torso. The police could tell from the forensic evidence that Sonia had tried to fight off her attacker, but had died from the wounds. Danny then pulled Sonia down to the foot of the bed, left her there, and then he headed back downstairs. Danny returned to the sleeping Christina and again placed a 6-inch duct tape over her mouth. He cut off her clothes, bound her hands with tape behind her, and assaulted her. Afterwards, he told Christina to lie down on her front, and he stabbed her in the back multiple times, killing her. But he didn't stop there. He returned to both of the victims, stripped their clothes, mutilated their bodies, and left them in explicit poses. Before he left, Danny washed himself, the bodies, and the area around them, wanting to destroy any physical evidence. The next night, Saturday the 25th, Danny Rolling headed to 3533 Southwest 24th Avenue, the home of 18-year-old Krista Hoyt, a student at Santa Fe College. He again used the screwdriver to pry open the door, but Krista wasn't at home at the time. And instead of leaving, Danny hid and waited for her to return for hours. After Krista entered her apartment, Danny jumped her, putting her in a chokehold and eventually placing duct tape over her mouth to prevent her from screaming. He bound her hands behind her back, stripped her of her clothes, and assaulted her. Like with Christina the previous day, Danny told Krista to lie on her front and he stabbed her in the back. This time though, unlike Christina, he also turned Krista back onto her back and cut her down her abdomen. Danny cleaned the scene like he had done the day before and returned to his campsite. But once he got there, he realised that he couldn't find his wallet and he thought he must have left it at Krista Hoyt's apartment. So he returned to the apartment to look for it. Once there, he apparently had the idea to decapitate the dead Krista. He posed her body as if it was sat on the edge of the bed and placed her head on the bookshelf opposite. Apparently, he later claimed this was to make it as shocking as possible for the person who discovered her. Again, it's a special kind of something. After the events of the last 2 days, Danny Rolling decided to rest on the Sunday. But in that time, his victims had been discovered. Christina Powell's parents had become worried after they hadn't heard from their daughter since Friday. They drove down to Gainesville and with the police, they were let into their daughter's apartment by maintenance, and that's when they made the horrifying discovery of their daughter and her roommate Sonia. The next day, the body of Krista Hoyt was discovered. These brutal murders sent the press and residents of Gainesville into a frenzy. Many students in the area had taken to changing their daily routines, walking in groups, and even sleeping in groups. Some even withdrew their enrollment and left the university and the town forever. And that panic would only get worse after, on Monday the 27th, there were 2 more victims. At 1:30 in the morning, Danny was heading to the home of 23-year-old Tracy Paulers and her roommate and friend, 23-year-old Manny Taboda. He'd heard people talking in the area about the murders and he'd seen the press coverage, and while he knew that he would have to leave Gainesville soon, it didn't stop him from committing more murders before he did. Danny laid in wait until 3 a.m. when he used his screwdriver again to open the door to the apartment. He first went into the bedroom of Manny. Danny stabbed Manny, and while Manny fought back, it just wasn't enough. He did, however, cover Danny in Manny's blood, and when Tracy ran into Manny's bedroom after having heard screams and the commotion, she was faced with Danny Rolling stood there covered in Manny's blood. Danny chased Tracy into her bedroom, having barged open the door, and like he'd done before, he taped Tracy's hands behind her back, assaulted her, made her lie on her front, and stabbed her in the back. He posed Tracy's body, but he left Manny's how it was. After the discovery of these murders, the colleges cancelled the first week of classes, and female students realised that with the murder of Manny Taboda, it meant that a male presence wasn't enough to deter the killer. But the deaths of Tracy and Manny were to be the last of this killing spree. Seeing as how Danny Rolling had worn gloves each time and had cleaned each scene, the police had very little to almost nothing to go on. There were, however, the marks on the doors where the killer had forced them open with a screwdriver. There was some DNA found at the first scene, and the fact that the murders had all been carried out in the same way. I mean, a killer's MO can often be as individual as a fingerprint. The police did initially suspect a student at the University of Florida called Edward Humphrey, but he was later cleared of all charges, and so they were back to square one. In the meantime, the Louisiana police had seen the Gainesville murders on the news, and a lot of the details were ringing huge alarm bells with them, and it reminded them of a case of murders that had taken place in Shreveport in November 1989. 53-year-old William Grissom lived with his 24-year-old daughter Julie, and at the time had his 8-year-old grandson Sean staying with him. On the evening of the 4th of November, between 6 p.m. and 8 p.m, a man had broken into the Grissom house while they were preparing for dinner, and he attacked the whole family. The attacker stabbed both William and Sean, leaving them in different rooms in the house. But with Julie, he had placed duct tape over her mouth and bound her hands behind her back. Just like the other victims, Julie had been assaulted and stabbed in the back. Her body had also been mutilated and posed, and the scene had been cleaned afterwards. While Danny Rolling had never been a suspect in the Grissom murders, they did take place in his hometown, and he was still wanted for the attack on his father. There was another piece of information that the Florida police received, this time from an old friend of Danny Rolling's, a woman from Shreveport called Cindy Jurakic. Oh, I'm so sorry. I don't know how to pronounce that name. Jurasis. She and her husband used to hang out with Danny Rollings before he left for Florida. And after having heard about the Gainesville murders, she recalled something Danny had once said to her, and the thought wouldn't leave her alone, so she decided to call Crime Stoppers with the tip. Danny had apparently said to her, quote, "One day I'm going to leave this town and I'm going to go where the girls are beautiful and I can just lay in the sun and watch beautiful women all day." End quote. And he had told her husband that he liked to stick knives in people. Safe to say, Cindy and her husband stopped spending time with Danny after that comment. With combined information from Cindy and the Louisiana police, the Florida police decided to investigate Danny Rolling. However, they didn't have to go far to find him. You see, 10 days after the police had found Tracy and Manny's body, Danny had robbed a supermarket in Ocala, Florida, and was subsequently arrested and held in Marion County Jail, which was 40 miles south of Gainesville. Florida police tested Rolling's blood against that of the DNA found at the murder scenes, and it was a match. Rolling was charged with the murder of all 5 of the students in November 1991, and almost 4 years after the attacks, he went to trial. Rowling pleaded guilty to the murders but didn't actually take responsibility for them. He claimed it was the fault of his father, of his ex-wife, and of another personality of his, one that he called Gemini. The name for this was inspired by him having seen The Exorcist 3 in cinemas, where there is a demon in that named Gemini. Despite his guilty plea, Danny Rowling was sentenced to death on the 20th of April 1994. But years later, before he was to be executed, Rowling decided that he wanted to clear his conscience and apologise for his crimes. So he finally wrote a statement, finally confessing to the Grissom murders. On the 25th of October 2006, Danny Rowling had a last meal of lobster tail and was executed by lethal injection. He was pronounced dead at 6:13 p.m. For anyone who's seen Scream, it's not hard to spot the similarities. A killer dressed in black, his face hidden from his victims, the victims being young students, and the brutality of the kills being committed with a knife. For me, one of the similarities that really stood out was the mutilation of poor Krista Hoyt, who'd been cut from top to bottom, a lot like Casey Becker from the opening scene of Scream. In the original script, Kevin Williamson had actually included a lot more violence and gore, so much more that his agent Rob Paris had advised him that it would make the script hard to sell. In fact, after Miramax purchased the script, Williamson was asked to remove a lot of the gorier moments that were either reminiscent of the mutilations that Danny Rowling had inflicted on his victims, or that depicted the aftermath of characters being gutted. When Wes Craven came on board the project, he was actually able to reinstate a chunk of the removed material, but not all of it. And even the reinstated material had to be done so creatively so as not to annoy the MPA. The MPA wanted a scene from the film's opening removed, the one where Casey Becker is running away from Ghostface, and in slow motion he grabs her from behind and stabs her in the chest. Apparently, to keep the scene in the film, Wes Craven told the MPA that they had only taken the one take of that scene, as Drew Barrymore had been, quote, too het up, and seen as how it's a pivotal moment, the scene remained. Another moment in the film that the MPA weren't exactly jumping for joy about was the final shot of the opening scene, where we see Casey Becker hung from a tree, her insides on the outside. According to Wes Craven, the shot where the camera pushes in on Casey was shot in real time, but they had to remove every other frame, and so it ended up being 50% shorter and faster than originally planned, a fact that Wes wasn't happy about. I think there's no denying that the Scream franchise has one of the most iconic looking killers in horror. A simplistic but frightening image of a form dressed all in black with nothing distinguishable other than its white ghost face mask. It's a striking image. When Kevin Williamson wrote the script, he described the killer as masked and even specified that it was a mask of a ghost face, but there was a problem. This was a whodunit mystery, and while Williamson had specified the mask, he hadn't specified anything else about what the killer was wearing. Wes Craven realised and pointed out that the audience would be able to identify the killer from their hands, their feet, or their body and clothing. According to the audio commentary by Wes Craven and Kevin Williamson, when they had a meeting about it, Kevin jovially said, "Well, it's not my problem, I'm just the writer." So, working from the ghost mask, they decided to create a full ghost costume, something shapeless and full length that could, within the film's world, hide the killer's identity. The look went through various versions before ending on a full white look with a cloak and a hood. However, as we all know, that's not the look we ended up with. At the last minute, one of the producers, Mariana Maddalena, suggested they change it to black, as she felt that that would be far scarier. According to Wes Craven, the mask itself was actually found in a house that they were location scouting at by the same producer, Maddalena. He said that it was just an off-the-shelf item that could be found in any dime store around Halloween time, but felt that it was perfect for their killer, and so they went about trying to obtain the rights to it. The mask itself was developed by Funworld as part of a series of Halloween masks titled Fantastic Faces, and was called the Peanut-Eyed Ghost. What a name. Its design was inspired by a few different things: the film poster of Pink Floyd's The Wall, ghostly characters seen in the 1930s cartoon Betty Boop, and finally, and probably most famously, from the 1893 painting by Edvard Munch named The Scream. The Scream is considered one of the most quintessential and recognisable pieces of artwork. The painting depicts a figure with their hands covering their ears and an anguished look on their face. Some believe the figure is screaming, while others believe that the figure is the one listening to a scream. That image of the anguished face is considered to be an incredible depiction of the anguish and anxiety of man, and with the figure dressed in what looks like a black cloak and its white elongated face, you can clearly see the resemblance. The designer of the original mask described it as having a horrible look, a sorry look, a frantic look. Ghostface's mask has a conflicting expression on it, one of someone screaming, but also one in pain, maybe even sad. I mean, he looks like he's crying. So there you go, guys, the true event that inspired the story of Scream and the inspirations behind the look of Scream's iconic killer, Ghostface. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know your thoughts on it down in the comments. If you're a fan of Scream, then don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss my next episode, which will be a review of Scream 6. I'm so excited, I cannot wait. But in the meantime, thank you as always for stopping by. I really do appreciate it. Take care of yourselves, and I will talk to you in the next episode. Bye, guys.